And now it's time for the next part of your story from Wind in the Willows. Do you remember that Ratty and Mole found a lovely big green door behind all the snow? So let's see what happened next. Faster and harder they dug until, in full view of the astonished Mole, a solid-looking door appeared. It was painted dark green. An iron bell hung by the side, and below it, on a small brass plate, were the words, "Mr. Badger." Mole fell backwards on the snow from surprise and delight. "Ratty, I can't believe it," he cried. "Get up at once and hang on to that bell pull," ordered Ratty. "Ring as hard as you can while I hammer." While the rat attacked the door with his stick, the mole sprang up at the door pull and swung from there. From a long way off, they could faintly hear a bell, and a while later, the sound of slow, shuffling footsteps. There was the noise of a bolt shooting back, and the door opened a few inches. "Now who is it disturbing people on such a night?" said a gruff voice. "Oh, Badger!" cried Ratty. "Let us in, please. It's me, Ratty. Mole and I have lost our way in the snow." "Why, Ratty, my dear little man," exclaimed the Badger in quite a different voice. "Come in, both of you. You must be frozen." The Badger looked down at them kindly and patted their heads. "This is not the sort of night for small animals to be out," he said. "Come into the kitchen. There's a lovely fire there, and supper and everything." He shuffled on in front of them, carrying the light, and they followed him down a long passage until they came to several doors. Badger threw open one of them and called them through. At once they found themselves all in the glow and warmth of a warm lit kitchen. The floor was red brick, and on the hearth there was a blazing log fire with a couple of high-backed seats on either side. "Sit down and toast yourselves," said Badger. Then he made them take off their wet coats and boots, and he fetched them dressing gowns and slippers. Warm and dry at last, it seemed that the wild wood they had left outside was miles and miles away. When at last they were thoroughly warm, the Badger called them to the table where he'd been busy laying a meal. He sat in his armchair at the head of the table as they ate their supper. Then he listened as Ratty and Mole told of their adventures in the wild wood. Mole began to think the Badger was really very friendly. After supper, they chatted some more by the fireside. Then Badger noticed how worn out they were. "It's time for bed," said Badger, getting up and fetching candles. He led the animals to a long room where he kept all his winter stores. There were piles of apples, turnips, potatoes, nuts, and jars of honey. But best of all were the two little beds by the wall, which Ratty and Mole soon fell into. When the rat and mole came out the next morning, they found two little hedgehogs sitting at the table eating porridge. "Did you youngsters lose your way in the snow as well?" the rat chuckled. "Yes, sir," said the elder hedgehog. "The weather out there is terribly bad." Suddenly the doorbell rang loudly, and Ratty sent the smaller hedgehog to answer it. There was the sound of stamping in the hall, and soon the otter appeared. He was delighted to see that Ratty and Mole were safe. "Thought I'd find you here all right," said the otter cheerfully. "Everyone on the river bank was very worried about you both. Ratty had never been home all night, nor Mole either. Something dreadful must have happened, they said, and the snow had covered up your tracks. I was going through the snow when I met a rabbit sitting on a stump. I had to cuff him round the ears to get any sense out of him. He did say he'd seen Mole, though, so I knew I was on the right track." "Weren't you at all nervous?" asked the Mole, remembering yesterday's terror in the wild wood. "Nervous?" the otter said, showing a shiny set of teeth as he laughed. "I'd give 'em nerves if they tried it on with me. Here, Mole, fry me some steak. I'm starving, and I've got a lot to say to Ratty. Haven't seen him for ages." Badger, who had been asleep in his study, was pleased to see the otter and invited him to lunch. "Here, you two youngsters, be off home to your mother," said Badger to the two young hedgehogs, as he gave them sixpence each and sent them on their way. All during that morning, the four friends talked and talked. After lunch, Otter and Ratty settled down to chat about their beloved river bank, while Badger lit a lantern and took Mole on a tour down the dim passages of his underground home. Now Mole was an underground animal, and Badger's house suited him exactly, but not Ratty. When they got back to the kitchen, they found him walking up and down, very restless, longing to get back to his riverbank. "Stop fretting, Ratty," said Badger. "My passages run further than you think. In fact, some of them run beneath the wood right to the very edge." The rat was eager to go, so Badger took his lantern and led the way through all the tunnels until at last they saw daylight at the end of the passage. Badger bade his friends a hasty goodbye and pushed them through the opening. They were right on the edge of the wild wood, and in the distance was the familiar glint of the river. Otter, who knew all the paths, took charge of the party, and they trailed out in a line for a distant stile. Together they turned and made for home, for firelight and for the voice of the river they knew and trusted.